A red sail breaks the gray horizon of the North Sea, a sudden stain of color in the mist. To the monks on the holy island of Lindisfarne, it is first a curiosity, then a concern, and finally, a fear they cannot name quickly enough. The year is 793, and the bell begins to toll not for prayer, but for panic. Men step from longships with the calm speed of people who have done this before, their axes and tools catching what little light the sky offers. They are not arriving to debate theology or to negotiate terms. They have come for portable wealth and quick advantage, and the shock of that realization changes the meaning of the coastline forever. In later memory, this becomes a turning point, the beginning of what some chroniclers would describe as a hard new age, when the sea itself felt less like a border and more like a road for danger. Welcome to Medieval Spirits. If you enjoy calm story-driven medieval history, please like the video, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you do not miss future episodes. The Viking raids of the late 8th to early 11th centuries were among the most feared military operations in medieval Europe. These Norse seafarers, originating from what is today Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, were renowned for maritime skill and precise timing, enabling swift attacks on coastal settlements and river towns alike. The first widely recorded raid occurred in 793 CE. At the monastery of Lindisfarne, on the northeast coast of England, and many historians treat it as a symbolic start to the Viking Age. Monasteries and churches were frequent targets, not only because they held valuable objects, but because they were lightly defended. And for the communities who lived around them, the attack felt like more than theft. It felt like the world had become unpredictable. Monasteries such as Jarrow Iona and Lindisfarne were repeatedly plundered, and the losses were more than financial. These religious sites housed manuscripts, gold, silver, and other treasures, and they also housed learning, memory, and local identity. To many raiders, a gold chalice was not a holy relic, but bullion metal to be traded, melted, or offered as a gift to build alliances back home. The psychological impact of attacking sacred spaces cannot be overstated. To Christian victims, the attackers could feel less like ordinary enemies and more like a punishment sent to humble the proud. Priests were assaulted, valuables were stripped away, and some survivors were taken captive. The Vikings' tactical approach was both sophisticated and ruthless. Their longships, designed for speed and agility, allowed them to strike unexpectedly and retreat before local forces could mount a defense, leaving communities with grief and a new kind of fear. The engineering of the Viking longship was a masterpiece of naval architecture, a tool of mobility perfectly honed for Europe's coasts and rivers. These ships were shallow-drafted, meaning they could float in only a few feet of waterland on almost any usable shore and be pushed back out just as quickly. That single feature made a wide world smaller. Vikings could sail across open sea and then navigate deep into river systems in England, Francia, and the lands that would become Russia, reaching towns that believed they were safely inland. They could appear with little warning, strike quickly, and vanish again into the same waterways that merchants used for trade. This ability to move between ocean and river made them a persistent threat in an age when roads were slow and communications were slower. The impact of these raids extended beyond immediate destruction. They disrupted economies, unsettled politics, and forced communities to rethink how they defended themselves. The unpredictability and ferocity of the attacks left a lasting impression on the European psyche, especially among the clergy who recorded events in writing. Chroniclers often describe the Vikings in language meant to warn readers and explain catastrophe, emphasizing foreignness, pagan worship, and the willingness to attack places Christians considered protected. The scholar Alcuin wrote that never before had such terror appeared in Britain as people now suffered from a pagan race, capturing how unprecedented these raids felt to educated observers. Stories also grew around special warriors, sometimes called berserkers, fighters said to enter a trance-like fury in battle. Modern historians debate how literal these accounts are, but the point is clear: the Vikings cultivated a reputation for fearlessness, and reputation itself can be a weapon. Even the dragon heads carved onto ship prows were more than decoration in the medieval imagination. They were meant to announce power before a single foot touched land. But raids were not only about gold. Over time, they became about land leverage and the right to demand tribute. As the Viking Age progressed, hit-and-run tactics evolved into settlement and conquest. The great heathen army that arrived in England in 865 was not a small raiding party. It was a large force with leaders' strategy and the intent to stay through seasons, negotiate from strength, and reshape kingdoms. Anglo-Saxon rulers responded with war diplomacy and payment, sometimes shifting between all three depending on the year. The payment, known as dangeld, often described as protection money, shows how violence could be converted into a political system. Fear of the Northmen became a defining feature of European politics for generations, pushing kingdoms to fortify towns, organize armies more consistently, and build the institutions that later look in hindsight like steps toward feudal structures of defense. While the sagas sing of battles and kings, the economic engine of the Viking world was also fueled by commerce, and one of its darkest branches involved the buying and selling of human beings. The Viking slave trade was a significant and brutal aspect of their society, intertwined with raiding and long-distance trade across Europe. We often romanticize Vikings as explorers, merchants, and warriors, but many Norse groups were also among the most active traffickers of the early Middle Ages. Capturing and trading slaves, often called thralls, became a cornerstone of wealth for some communities, linking violence at the edge of the sea to markets far away. Viking raids frequently resulted in captives taken from the British Isles, the Frankish world, and Slavic territories. The connection between Slav and the later English word slave is often discussed as a reflection of how many Eastern Europeans were caught in these networks. The Vikings did not discriminate by age or gender in this system. Men, women, and children could be seized, separated from family, and treated as property. A healthy adult might be valued for farm labor, ship work, or construction, while others might be forced into domestic service and isolated by language and custom. Some captives were moved eastward into trade networks that connected to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, where demand for enslaved people was high and roots were well established. The treatment of thralls was dehumanizing by definition. Rights were limited or non-existent, and their safety depended on the character of an owner rather than on law. Trading centers such as Dublin, Hedeby, and Birka flourished in part because of this commerce in human lives. Dublin, in particular, is often described as a major slave market in Western Europe, a place where the profits of trade were built on family separation and coerced labor. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, who encountered Norse traders known as the Rus along the Volga River in the 10th century, described their practices and way of life with a mix of fascination and disapproval. He wrote a famous line calling them filthy, criticizing their hygiene and habits in a way that reflects both genuine observation and cultural bias. Beyond daily customs, he also noted the presence of enslaved women and described how, in his view, they were treated as merchandise in public settings. Medieval travel writing can be blunt and sometimes sensational, but Ibn Fadlan's account is valuable because it is an outsider's description recorded close to the time. And it reminds us that Viking power was not only built on ships and raids, it was also built on commerce, and commerce included people as goods. Despite the cruelty of the system, some thralls did eventually gain freedom or integrate into Norse communities over generations, and their descendants became part of the cultural and genetic fabric of regions under Viking influence. When vengeance was demanded, Viking stories sometimes describe execution as ritualized display, meant to send a message that would travel farther than any ship. The blood eagle is one of the most notorious and controversial methods of execution attributed to the Vikings. In later retellings, it is presented as an extreme punishment reserved for the most hated enemies, usually those accused of killing a king or a father. The ritual is described in several Norse sagas, although its historical accuracy remains a subject of intense debate among scholars. Some argue it is a literary invention or a misunderstanding of poetic language about leaving bodies to birds of prey. Others believe that, at least in some form, it reflects real practices of terror and ceremonial revenge associated with war and honor culture. According to saga descriptions, the victim's back is cut, and the ribs are separated in a way meant to create a wing-like shape, turning a body into a terrifying symbol. For modern audiences, the graphic mechanics can overshadow the central point, which is psychological. The act, if it occurred, would have been designed to frighten enemies, impress followers, and proclaim that the victor had complete control. One of the most cited references appears in the Orkney Inga saga, where it describes the execution of the Northumbrian king Aella by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok. The saga's wording is vivid, and later retellings often repeat it as proof of Viking cruelty, even as historians remind us that sagas were written down long after the events they describe and were shaped by storytelling traditions. This is reportedly described as revenge for Aella's execution of Ragnar, who in legend was thrown into a pit of snakes. Another account appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which, while not matching the saga's detail, supports the idea that Viking reprisals could be severe and politically charged. Whether fact or fiction, the blood eagle represents an idea that shaped Viking reputation vengeance, elevated into ceremony domination, made visible to an audience. It also invites a more careful reading of evidence. From a forensic standpoint, if the most extreme version were attempted death, would likely occur quickly from shock and trauma, making the later display more about intimidation than prolonged suffering. In that sense, the story tells us as much about the politics of fear and reputation as it does about any single method of killing. If the blood eagle is the punishment in legend, the method used to kill the hero in that legend is equally memorable. The Viking snake pit is one of the most chilling execution stories attributed to the Norse world, a practice steeped in both saga and medieval imagination. It is most famously associated with Ragnar Lothbrok. According to the legend, Ragnar was captured by King Aella of Northumbria after a shipwreck. Aella, unable to kill Ragnar with ordinary weapons in some versions of the story, ordered him thrown into a pit of snakes. Other versions add a protective silk shirt, emphasizing the saga's blend of history, symbolism, and myth. What remains consistent is the theme: Ragnar is denied an honorable death and is instead offered a frightening, humiliating end. Historical evidence for snake pit executions is scarce, and much of what is known comes from sagas and medieval chronicles, which often blend real conflicts with moral lessons and entertainment. However, the symbolism is potent. In Norse mythology, serpents and poison are linked to underworld danger, and the bound god Loki is famously associated with venom dripping near him. Snakes represented a death that felt hidden, humiliating, and outside the heroic ideal of dying with a weapon in hand. In a warrior culture that prized reputation and execution like this, whether literal or literary, worked as a message. The victor controls not only your life, but also the story of your death. That is part of why the legend endured. The reality of such a pit in medieval Northumbria is debated. Adders are the only venomous snakes native to Britain, and gathering enough to fill a pit would have been a logistical challenge, especially under the pressure of war. Still, legends do not need perfect logistics to reshape politics. Ragnar's death song, the Krakumal, depicts him meeting death with defiance and boasting that his sons would avenge him, planting the seed for later conflict in the audience's mind. And come they did, according to tradition, bringing the great heathen army and setting off cycles of war that changed the map of England. Whether the snakes were real adders or a poetic device, the psychological force of the story is undeniable. It captures a primal fear, and it turns that fear into a banner for revenge. The Vikings did not only kill enemies in war, Some sources also describe ritual sacrifice, known as belti, as an integral aspect of Norse religious practice, serving as a means to honor the gods, secure favor, and ensure prosperity. The gods of the north, such as Odin, Thor, and Frey, were not always imagined as benevolent. They demanded respect and reciprocity. The logic of sacrifice was often transactional gifts offered in exchange for protection, harvest, and success. These rituals could involve animals, valuable objects, and in some accounts, human beings. The BLT ceremonies were deeply rooted in the Viking worldview, which emphasized a reciprocal relationship between humans and the divine, as well as the belief that the community's fortune depended on maintaining right relations with powerful forces. The primary purpose of a BLT was to gain the favor of the gods, ensuring bountiful harvest success in battle and general well-being. One of the most detailed written accounts comes from Adam of Bremen, whose work Gesta Hammaburgensis Ecclesia Pontificum describes sacrifices held at the Temple of Uppsala in Sweden. He claims that every 9th year they gathered for a great feast and offered 9 males of many living creatures, including humans, to the gods. Adam's tone is hostile and moralizing, and historians debate how accurate his numbers and details are. Still, his account matters because it reflects how Christian observers interpreted Scandinavian ritual life, and because it suggests that large public ceremonies were part of religious identity in the region. Adam of Bremen also describes the aftermath, saying bodies were displayed in a sacred grove near the temple, an image meant to shock readers and underline pagan otherness. Archaeological evidence supports parts of the broader picture, though not always the dramatic framing. Across Scandinavia and Viking settlements, excavations have revealed ritual sites and offerings, including animal remains and deposits that suggest ceremonial killing in religious contexts. Burials like the Oseberg ship burial show how ritual, wealth, and belief could mix in ways that feel distant to us, but were meaningful to them. Even when we cannot confirm every written detail, the combined evidence points to a society where religion, community, and power were often expressed through public ceremony, and where the line between sacred and violent could be thinner than modern viewers expect. Perhaps the most disturbing account of Viking sacrifice comes from an eyewitness report. In 921, Ibn Fadlan witnessed the funeral of a Rus chieftain on the Volga. He describes it not as a quiet burial, but as a public ritual that unfolded over days filled with drink chanting and formal gestures meant to honor status. A ship was prepared and stocked with weapons, food, and treasures. The chieftain could not go to the next world empty-handed because rank was imagined to continue beyond death. But Ibn Fadlan also reports something more troubling. An enslaved young woman was expected to die as part of the rite described as a volunteer in a context where true choice is questionable. Ibn Fadlan describes how the young woman was led from tent to tent in a sequence of steps presented as ceremonial farewells. He reports that men used the ritual to exploit her, telling her to deliver messages to the dead man as if their actions were expressions of loyalty. For modern audiences, this is one of the hardest passages to read because it shows how a community can hide coercion inside tradition and call it devotion. Ibn Fadlan also mentions an older woman who appears to supervise the rite, sometimes translated as an angel of death, a figure responsible for guiding the ritual to its conclusion. Whether every detail is filtered through Ibn Fadlan's cultural lens or not, the underlying theme is clear: status and power shaped who was protected and who was used. On the final day, Ibn Fadlan writes that the group made loud noise, including striking shields to cover what was happening, perhaps so others would not be frightened or refuse similar roles in the future. He then describes the killing directly. The young woman was restrained, killed during the ritual placed beside the chieftain, and the ship was set on fire. We do not need graphic detail to understand the meaning. The act served beliefs about the afterlife and the dead man's prestige, but it also served the living by demonstrating power in the most final way possible. The story is valuable, not because it is sensational, but because it forces us to see how ideology can make cruelty feel normal to those who benefit from it. And it reminds us that behind heroic sagas, there were vulnerable people whose lives were treated as expendable. The era of the Vikings eventually came to an end, fading not with a single battle, but with a slow transformation. Conversion to Christianity in the 11th century reshaped public ritual and gradually changed laws and norms, including attitudes toward sacrifice and the open slave trade, at least in its pagan form. The raiders became rulers, traders, and landholders. Vikings who settled in France became the Normans, and those in England became Anglo-Scandinavians, blending cultures through intermarriage, language change, and new political arrangements. They built churches instead of burning them, and they wrote laws instead of relying only on vengeance. The Viking Age did not vanish overnight. It was absorbed into the structures of medieval Europe. The image of the Viking as a bloodthirsty barbarian is partly a construction of their victims, especially monks, who wrote chronicles and had every reason to emphasize terror. But archaeology also reminds us that violence was real and widespread and that it went both ways. Mass graves, trauma on skeletons, and the hard evidence of conflict show an era in which communities lived with constant insecurity. The mass grave at Ridgeway Hill in Dorset, where decapitated men were thrown into a pit, is one example that suggests brutality was not a one-sided story. This was a harsh age where survival could depend on alliances, fortified towns, and the strength of your shield wall. The Vikings were not mythical monsters. They were human beings shaped by the values and pressures of their world, operating within cultural frameworks that often celebrated aggression and accepted cruelty as a legitimate tool of power. Today, we look back at the Vikings with a mix of fascination and caution. We admire their ships' navigation art and storytelling, and we can respect their skill without excusing the harm they caused. At the same time, it is important to remember the smoke over Lindisfarne, the households broken by slavery, and the silent lives lost in rituals and wars. History is not only the story of conquerors. It is also the story of the vulnerable, the displaced, and the communities that rebuilt after the longships disappeared into the fog. If you found this exploration helpful, please like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell for more educational content with medieval spirits. Together, we can look at the past honestly and thoughtfully without turning suffering into entertainment. The Viking Age did not end with a single dramatic curtain drop. It changed, merged, and moved forward, leaving behind both remarkable legacies and hard lessons.